Michael Pedini, and I'm a lecturer in forestry. And welcome to this presentation about health and safety for students on site visits and field trips. This presentation will be about how your lecturers and the field trip organizers will manage your safety on field trips. First, I'm going to give you an overview of the presentation. I'll be starting off by putting this presentation into the context of the Department of Science, Health and Safety regulations. Then I'm going to talk about risk-based health and safety management. I'm going to talk about hazard identification and risk assessment, abbreviated as HIRA, which is the kind of methodology that lecturers will use to plan the health and safety management of field trips. Then I'm going to talk about hazards on field trips and site visits, hazards we can come across. I'm going to give a special mention of Lyme disease, Weil's disease, and allergy to insect bites. Then I'm going to demonstrate how we would perform a HIRA before a field trip or a site visit using an agreed template and procedure. Then at the end, I'm going to talk about student responsibilities on field trips. And at the very end, I'll talk about a new risk assessment that has been introduced, which is for lone working for third and fourth year projects. If you're collecting data in the field or working alone outside of the college and even inside the college, there is a special risk assessment that had to be performed. So what do the departmental health and safety regulations say about field trips? In the excuse me, in the departmental safety statements in section 6.9, it gives a definition and commitment to health and safety. So I'll just read that out. Field trips may be defined as institute organized visits for the purpose of teaching or research and in places which are not under the institute control, but where the institute is responsible for the safety of its staff, students, and others exposed to its activities. The school will take all reasonable steps to secure the safety, health, and welfare of staff and students while participating in field trip activities. So you can read this as a kind of a commitment of the department to secure everyone's safety, health, and welfare. In the departmental safety handbook, which you should have been provided with, in Appendix 3, there is a section specifically dealing with site visits and field trips, and you should definitely read that. There's a lot of important information in that. And just, why do we call it site visits and field trips? The difference is that site visits are led by a host. Field trips are led by a WIT staff lecturer, and the host of the land or the landowner or whoever is responsible for the site might not be present. So health and safety management is risk-based. What that means, or what that implies, is that on site visits and field trips, the hazards that we'll come across are often quite unique compared to a lab setting where the hazards are very well defined, as you will have seen, very well described, and so on. Whereas when we're going on field trips, we're visiting farms, forests, nurseries, pharmaceutical chemical plants. We could go to water treatment plants, just being in nature along coasts and so on and so forth, on mountains. The risks there, or the hazards there, are quite unique to the sites and the day that we are out. So therefore, we apply something called risk-based health, safety, and welfare management. And what that involves is that we will identify possible hazards. We will identify precautionary measures that are already in place, which we call controls. So how do we secure student welfare? And then we will make an assessment of the risk to people or to the participants on the basis of two things. First of all, the likelihood of the occurrence happening, and secondly, on the severity of any harm to people. We can have hazards that are quite severe, like fall from rock faces or being hit by a moving vehicle and something like that. But we can also come across things that, of course, are minor in terms of severity, the injury that can happen to people. So, if required, we add appropriate additional control measures to control the risk to students and staff alike. So, a practical and the agreed way that lecturer will deal with these issues is to perform a hazard identification and risk assessment, also called a HIRA, where we're using a template that we have agreed in the department, and we use it prior to any site visit or field trip. To carry out this HIRA is the responsibility of the lecturer, but it is of course done with the help of the landowner or the host, and also with the expected collaboration and of course compliance by you as students. Before we move on, I just want to give a few relevant definitions. Hazard is a potential source of harm or adverse health effect on person or persons. A risk is defined as the likelihood that a person might be harmed or suffers adverse health effect if exposed to a hazard. And we break that into severity and likelihood. So severity can range from very minor injuries and to obviously serious injuries. Likelihood is the chance, the chance we should call it maybe, that something will happen, that the accident will happen, that will cause the harm. And those two combines will be called the risk rating. In order to minimize risk, we put some control measures, we take some precautions, and in order to discuss that, I might define the word principle of risk control, which is how we reduce and likelihood and the severity of any ill effect. So there are several options there, as you can see: avoidance, elimination at source, proper working procedure, proper behavior, and PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So we have certain options in terms of risk control. We can completely avoid the risk. If we, for example, observe that the weather conditions are very poor, like a red weather alert for a storm, we can completely avoid the risk by canceling the field trip. Sometimes that is necessary. Sometimes we can eliminate the risk at source. An example of that I see when we visit sawmills, where one of the hazards that we experience is noise. And in a very noisy environment, it is possible to put some of the machines, encase them in a soundproof box, and thereby reducing the elimination at source. It's not maybe an option that is available to us when we're doing our own work in a field trip, but in those cases we can apply proper working procedures or proper behavior that are safe and makes the work safe. If none of these possibilities are possible, we will resort to prescribing the use of personal protective equipment, which could be earmuffs, hard hats, high visibility vests, and so on. And it is not possible to avoid all accidents happening. Accidents do happen, as we know, but what we are required to by law is to put in place all reasonably practicable controls to reduce the risk to ourselves and to students. The hazards we can come across on field trips are obviously manifold. I have a small list here, but it's not an exhaustive list. But for example, starting with the travel to and from a site, maybe in an institute organized bus, there's definitely a hazard getting in and out of the bus safely, whether the bus is parked in a safe place when students are trying to get in and out. And that has to be managed in a safe way, of course. On the site, there could be moving machinery, big tractors, trucks, forklifts, and so on. There could be livestock, cattle, bulls, so on. There's the usual standard slips, trips, and falls. Very, very possible in nature, in a forest scenario, for example, anywhere really where it's untidy, slips, trips, and falls has to be managed. Good footwear, for example, is a requirement. Severe weather conditions. The Institute has an adverse weather policy that we follow. Being near water, particularly, well, not particularly, but lakes, rivers, and the sea. If we're using hand tools, cutting tools, and so on. Manufacturing equipment could be hot, it could be sharp, it could be applying heavy pressure, chemicals exposure, toxic plant material, noise, falling objects, ticks, outside ticks, wasps, and so on. People who have an allergy towards stings of wasp and so on. We'll talk about more of that later. Contaminated water, and so on. As I said, the list is almost endless, but what we do as lecturers and in collaboration with the host is we focus on the relevant hazards. We don't put in every possible option, but we focus on the relevant hazards. I would like to give a special mention of Lyme disease, Weil's disease, and insect stings or insect bites. There is a lot more information in your handbook and on Moodle about these things, and they're written by health professionals, and they're much more valuable than what I can say here now, but I really would encourage you to read it. So just Lyme disease is an infection caused by bacteria. It is transmitted to humans by bites from ticks that are infected with the bacteria. And I should say that not all ticks are infected, but a certain proportion are in this country. And certain areas in the country are more affected by it than others. You can minimize the risk of bites by wearing long trousers, long sleeve shirts, and gaiters, using an insect repellent. Always remember to check your skin and hair for ticks after a day in the field and remove them straight away as soon as possible, and possibly consulting with a GP if symptoms develop. And the symptoms you can read about in the handout. Weil's disease is also a type of bacterial infection. It is transmitted to humans through contact with urine from rodents and cattle, through cuts and scrapes on the skin. Its particularly risky areas are watercourses and lakes. So if you're putting your hand in to take water samples, for example, or for other reasons, you're better using rubber gloves and protecting yourself that way. Allergy to insects, wasps, probably is the most relevant, or bees. You will be aware of that, and you should tell the lecturer in advance, and bring EpiPens and so on and so forth if it's relevant. Okay, so now we come finally to how to perform a HIRA, hazard identification risk assessment. And as I was saying, we're using a template that we have agreed between us in the Department of Science. It's basically a form, a piece of paper, and it's filled out by the lecturer in conjunction with the host of the site or the owner of the site. And also, ideally, if students could participate as well, would be great, because it's a very good learning experience for your future careers as managers. A lot of other, not only field trips, but you could do the same thing in a chemical lab. You could do it in any workplace, this kind of risk assessment. So first of all, up here at the top, you have what the activity, which area we're going to, what activity is going to happen, who has assessed it, typically the lecturer and the host, what date was it done, and who might be harmed, which could be all participants or students, or students and or the visitors, or something like that. Then we have the first column here is the activity, what's going on. It could be, for example, taking water samples in the River Shore. What is the hazard? Hazard is falling into the water, potentially drowning, to say the extreme. And what are the current controls that are in place? Let's start with saying there are no controls. We just go down to the water and or to the river bank and take our water sample, and then we give it a score then for likelihood and severity. And I think you might be possible for you to zoom in on the boxes down here. I can't do it from where I am at the moment, but if you see here, the score for likelihood can go from very unlikely up to very likely, and the number you're getting, the score you're getting, is from 1 to 5. The severity can go from minor injury up to potentially fatal accident, and the scores here as well are going 1 to 5. It's the lecturers doing his best or her best to identify what rating should be given, and it's put in here for likelihood and severity, and then it's multiplied, and the resulting risk rating is then compared to the risk score rating down here, and we have a green zone, and we have a yellow zone and a red zone that will give us the risk rating. So if it's green, if it's between 1 and 4, it's okay to continue with the activity without any improved control. If it's in the higher risk group, I can't see the numbers here, unfortunately. Medium risk group, we will definitely consider. We will definitely do something to reduce the risk. And if it's red, we will also do much more to reduce the risk. And this is what we put in here. What is the additional improved control measures that we will put in? And then with them in place, what is the likelihood and the severity and the final risk rating? and who is the person responsible for carrying out. So let's say we were taking these water samples. We could say, okay, we'll put a life vest on the person taking the water sample, and we will put maybe a rope, tie a rope around their waist. We will then reduce the likelihood and the severity of what could happen potentially, and bring it down into the green zone, and we can move on and carry out the activity. But if it is yellow, or definitely if it's red, we will not do the activity. We will have to come up with some alternative way of getting our data. So here's an example, a filled out risk assessment example. It is from the college itself, from the car park area, and you have the activity here, who has assessed it, the date, and who can be harmed. It's staff, students, and persons in the vicinity. So what's the task? This particular task is for entering and getting out of the car park. What is the hazard? A pedestrian could be struck by a vehicle. And what current control are there? There are sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, and so on. They should provide a relatively safe means of access and egress. The risk rating has been scored 4 and 3. We multiply that and we get 12, which is in the yellow zone. We want to do something, and obviously the assessor has said, it's the speed of the car that is the major problem regarding severity and likelihood. So if we put in speed limit signs and maybe some ramps, then we can reduce both the likelihood and the severity, and down to a risk rating of 4, which will then allow us to say that that is safe to enter and walk around the car park. So that is basically how this HIRA takes place, and as I was saying, done by the lecturer in advance of the field trip, maybe days in advance, maybe for it has been visited, the site has been visited in advance with the host, or maybe it's just done in the morning before the tour, the visit starts, and there will be a safety briefing with the host of the site. We're doing a lot ourselves in advance of turning up on a site by having prescribed personal protective equipment that students have to bring along on all field trips. This personal protective equipment is program specific, and in your safety handbook you can see for each program what personal protective equipment you have to buy, the first year, second year, and third year, and fourth year field trips. So I have just put down here the forestry personal protective equipment. We always wear high visibility vests. We always wear steel toe cap boots or Wellingtons if it's steel toe cap Wellingtons on a wet day. Hard hats fitted with ear defenders for hearing protection, and we also wear safety glasses because a lot of places are now prescribing the use of safety glasses for dust and flying splinters and so on and so forth. When we're going on site visits and field trips, always be mindful that we are on somebody else's property. We have been invited. We are in their business, their factory, their forest, their farm, the nursery, and so on. And they're kind of taking a risk already by inviting us because they're responsible for our health and safety. So it's really important that we behave properly in these places and behave responsibly. But other responsibilities that are upon ye as students are to wear proper clothing for the weather condition that you will experience on the day. You absolutely have to follow safety instructions that are provided by the host and the lecturer. You have to all the time act responsibly in order not to endanger yourself or each other. You have to wear the prescribed PPE. In forestry, we don't allow students to come on the field trip unless they have brought all their PPE. They won't even be allowed up on the bus. You have to read your student's safety handbook. You have to inform lecturer or head of department about health conditions that might require special precautions. I can't think of any examples at the moment, but maybe EpiPens, need to know about allergies or something like that. It's a very private matter, but it just has to be spoken with your lecturer or head of department, course leader about that. You have to wear seat belts on the buses, and I've also added a point there about current COVID-19 guidelines. As we know, these change all the time, and at the moment they change for the better, we could say. So I'm not going to say much about COVID guidelines. The Institute has COVID guidelines up. They are the ones we follow. The official COVID-19 guidelines are also followed in buses and on field trips in terms of social distancing, in terms of hand sanitizing, and so on and so forth. Wear masks on buses at the moment, and so forth. Okay, you'll be glad to hear that this is my last slide, primarily aimed at third and fourth year students for their research project. It is the new rules about lone working regulations that have been introduced. So you could be working on your own in the college, in labs, at weekends and evenings, and so on and so forth. You could also do your field calculation, field collection of data, and you might be on your own there. It is something we do not recommend that you work alone. But if it's inevitable, you have to fill out a HIRA form if you're independently collecting data outside of WIT controlled areas. So that could be third and fourth year students, research projects, and also postgraduate research project. And it's the student's responsibility to fill out this HIRA form. It's a special one, a separate one to the one I have shown you, but the supervisor must approve it and sign off along with the students. And as I said, we strongly recommend that students do not work alone, but sometimes it can be desirable or unavoidable, and then this separate lone working risk assessment has to be carried out and signed by the student, the supervisor, and Waterford IT's health and safety officer. So it's quite a serious matter, of course. This is all to safeguard yourselves, and you will have to talk to your research supervisor or project supervisor about it. So this is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for watching all the way to the end.